We have two presenters from Arizona in the United States for our next keynote address. Dr. Lee D. Lambert is Chancellor at Pima Community College District based in Tucson, Arizona, and his colleague, Dr. Ricardo Castro-Salazar, is Vice President, International Development. Today they're going to give a joint presentation about how the knowledge economy, automation and global interconnectedness are driving higher education towards greater internationalisation, particularly in their home state. Pima Country Community College is also one of the finalists in the awards this evening. Please welcome them.
Good morning, everybody. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Good morning. I'll just go ahead and start talking even if our PowerPoint's not up yet. So can you imagine taking over a district that no longer receives state funding? Can you imagine taking over a district in which employers tell you that you are irrelevant? Can you imagine taking over a district that you must disrupt from within? And can you imagine going to a community? I moved from Seattle, Washington, as the president of Shoreline Community College, to a community that does not believe in global and internationalization. Those are the four realities that I embrace. So we're going to talk about our presentation in that context and answer those questions, if you will, from the standpoint of the impact of Industry 4.0 and global education. Since I don't have, oh, it's up there. Okay, perfect. Okay. So how did we respond when we learned that we will no longer receive state funding? We were based on the model of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 from the state, 1/3 from local funding, and 1/3 from tuition and fees. Well, one key way was we need to start thinking about approaching this from a planning perspective, looking at trends and data. And so looking at the trends and data, we brought in an outside organization to work with us to map our internal assets with the community's assets. And as a result of that, we came up with two priority areas that we would focus on. Guided pathways, and I'm not really going to talk about that, but the next one I want to talk about is the centers of excellence. And that focused specifically on answering the question about the relevancy with the employers. So we saw this as an opportunity to take our budget reality and look at where the future was going by dialoguing with our employer community. So we held summits with employers in the applied technology arena, in IT, in healthcare, and a number of other areas to say, what do you need as you see your sectors being transformed by the advances in technology and the like? And so out of that, we walked away realizing that we can create these centers of excellence focused in certain particular areas that relate to the community's best interests. And so we also walked away realizing that we have a chance to play a thought leadership role because we have the ability to convene. So coming out of this, we realized folks will come if we ask them. But this may be our last chance to ask them in terms of where we were, in terms of our relevancy to where their futures were. But I'll give you an example. We just recently convened a industry of manufacturers, small, medium manufacturers, with our partners, Advanced Robotics for Manufacturing. They're based out of Carnegie Mellon. Because many of our small mediums, we learned, were not keeping pace with the realities of robotics. So we had a chance to expose them to that reality. So it was an interesting twist of fate. But the other thing I learned from all this is the college, it wasn't that the college wasn't interacting with businesses, it was interacting with only a certain segment of businesses, not the whole ecosystem. So the whole ecosystem was the one telling me you're not relevant. We were just talking to the ones who said we were relevant. But the problem was they weren't relevant. So really having to come to terms with, are you really talking to all segments of that sector to get a broader understanding of what's going on? And then you just kind of go around the wheel. And I don't want to go through all that because I really want to focus on specific industry partnerships that we have built in my 5 years being at the district. First one being this group called the National Coalition of Certification Centers. So back in 2007, this is when I was in Seattle, I was invited to a meeting with Gateway Technical College in Kenosha, Wisconsin, Snap-on Industrial, to sit down and talk about a certain reality. And that reality was, from Snap-on's perspective, and I think many of you are familiar with Snap-on Industrial, that we educators were not meeting their needs so that they could fully realize the benefits of their technology as they deploy them into the marketplace. So what can we do together to change that direction? So coming out of there, we founded this organization called the National Coalition of Certification Centers that are a public and private partnership focused on the colleges delivering to the needs of business and industry. But we also realize as part of that is that the faculty member is the lowest common denominator in the equation. So if the faculty members are not keeping pace with the advances in technology, we in turn cannot skill up our students to keep pace with the technologies. So one of the hallmarks of NC3 is this notion of train the trainer. So every year we run a number of train the trainer sessions in the areas of transportation with the focus on automotive, heavy equipment, aviation, also in advanced manufacturing, and in the energy sector. So our partnership network now has expanded to include Train Company, FC Chrysler, Starrett, 3M, Festo. As you can imagine, we're bringing on board a lot of these multinational corporations who don't just function in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or Tucson, Arizona. They function globally. But then also how they also impact the local ecosystem of the small, medium enterprises. So as a result of this organization, we were able to start to turn the tide. By me bringing them in from my time in Seattle to Pima, we started to redirect the mindset of the college in terms of its responsiveness to industry. But again, as I pointed out, this focus on the faculty members was key, because many of our faculty members, they might have started out in industry, but now they're 10, 15, 20 years removed. They don't know what's going on oftentimes. They're not going back in and reconnecting. So this really made a big difference. But in the end of the day, NC3 is the third-party validator of the skills we claim that the students are acquiring related to those micro-credentials of these employers I just identified. So that's the advantage of this industry partnership, and it has grown significantly over the last 10 years. And our goal is to get to 1 million certifications. And we're already at 100,000. We'll double it next year, and you can imagine doubling it again. So this notion of acceleration is starting to happen. We've been doubling every year, by the way, and we're just like I mentioned in our 10th anniversary year. So let me go back a moment. So let me talk about a few other partnerships. So taking this concept and mindset, we've been working with Caterpillar. So Caterpillar recently moved into Tucson, Arizona, and they said to us, our engineers don't know how to engineer. Wait a minute, right? They just went to a university. Some of them went to some top-name universities, but yet they don't know how to engineer. Now, why is that? Because they are getting the theory at the universities. What they're not getting is the applied side. So what Caterpillar was discovering is they had to go back and rework lots of the design, et cetera, of these engineers, which would then in turn cost millions of dollars. Because they would think, you put this over here, and then when you go and talk to that welder, the welder says, I can't weld it in that position. You get the idea, right? So what was the goal here with Caterpillar was we're going to bring engineers back to the community college to learn how machining works. So we created a basic machining course. Our faculty were the ones who sat down with Caterpillar to create this course. And then our welding faculty did the same thing. And we're going to move this over into mechatronics. We're going to move this over into woodworking. So all the pieces that Caterpillar needs, we're going to be working with them. They put a premium on lifelong learning. So when I talk to the VP that runs the surface mining division, which is headquartered now in Tucson, Arizona, she says, we hire everybody with the focus on their commitment to their lifelong learning. Because that engineer today coming out of school, in 2 years they'll be obsolete. So we have to constantly focus on. So they bake it in other words, lifelong learning is baked in. And oh, by the way, since we've done this with Caterpillar, students from the University of Arizona's engineering program are coming to us saying, how do we get in on this? Others, the small, medium firms are also coming to us saying, how do we get into this? And this other company I'm going to highlight here shortly, Too Simple, a Chinese company that is focused on autonomous vehicle technologies, specifically in the trucking industry. They are testing trucks on the roads in the state of Arizona, and they have plans to scale up to hundreds of trucks in the very near future. Well, they came to us, and this goes to this notion of specialization versus generalization. Some folks might call this hybridization, where in their case, they came to us and said, we have a social responsibility to the displacement of the truck driver. So let's work together to figure out how we keep truck drivers employed. So the reality is it's no longer good enough to have domain knowledge in one area. So we're working with them to define the truck driver now as also a logistics and trade expert. Also define them as an IT expert and an auto technician. Because that onboard computer system, if it goes down, that truck driver needs to know how to service that, right? If the truck itself breaks down, not because of the onboard computer system, they need to know how to service that, and they need to understand what the business is all about. So that's how we're now thinking about the work of the truck driver. And by the way, this is work for probably all of us in this room now. How do we start thinking differently about our own work? And how do we acquire skills in multiple domains to keep ourselves relevant? And so we're working with Too Simple. But the other piece, the reason why I want to highlight them is, after the Caterpillar announcement, guess what they said to us? Can we send our engineers to truck driving school? Because they realize their engineers would be more enhanced, value added, if they understood what that truck driver went through. You get it, right? So that was another important piece of learning through that. Also, we've been working with a large, very large military contractor, defense contractor, who happens to be located in Tucson, Arizona. And I'll just use an aside. They said, if North Korea shot a bomb at the U.S., we can shoot that down, just to give you an idea of what kind of defense contractor I'm talking about. We're actually talking to them about applied learning and how we incorporate industry-recognized apprenticeships. Because for those of you who are not familiar, in the U.S., there's a lot of resistance to this notion of apprenticeships by a lot of companies. But yet, the Trump administration decided to convene a group of employers and others to redefine what that means. And that redefinition coming out of that work was this notion of industry-recognized apprenticeships. So we're working with this employer and many others in the same kind of way as part of this new focus on industry partnerships. So then, let me I'm going to go ahead and just hit on a few other points. The other thing I want to emphasize is we have to disrupt ourselves continuously. So I'm going to convene an artificial intelligence task force, because with 4.0 and 5.0 in the horizon, we can't sit on our laurels. I'm seeing these employers coming to us asking for new ways of thinking about learning. We have to constantly adapt. But the issue is, do we as an institution, are we prepared to adapt too? It's not just us adapting to their education training needs, it's also us adapting as well. So we're going to focus on this piece. And so things to consider, and I'm not going to just read through this, you can see it on your own, is there's a new reality that we're all faced with. And as long as I'm the chancellor and CEO of Pima Committee, we're going to step up to that reality. So I just want to close by saying on my piece, we're thinking about what is the potential new jobs coming out of, and I always tell my folks, we have no reason to fear the robots as long as we work with the robots, right? So imagine all these new types of job opportunities that will be created if we start to think differently about that reality. And by the way, this comes from a book called Human Plus Machine. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ricardo to talk about how we then map this all over into how the global education piece plays into all this.
Can I use your...
Yes.
Well, as you have heard a lot in recent times in the United States, there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of political talk about building walls and doing all these new approaches to collaboration. And the reality is that based on what we have been discussing here, it is not really the Chinese or the Mexican who will be taking jobs away from Americans. It is this technological transformation that we have been talking about. With that, one of the other initiatives that Chancellor Lambert has started and I've been part of is this new approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we are a reflection of the world. When we think about diversity, think and I'm putting this in the context of the United States, of course, because that's the reality that I know best. But imagine there are 320 languages spoken in the United States. Talk about diversity. In Tucson, where we live, we have a community that is an immigrant community. We have been designated as a refugee settlement region. We have about 20,000 refugees from like 40 different countries. And we have many Mexican origin population, for example. And in general, in the country, you can see that things are changing very rapidly. When you look at the way in which our population is evolving, there's a very dramatic shift. Like one of the presenters said yesterday, shift happens. And this is certainly an example because it will affect basically everything and the way we look at ourselves. But of course, there is always fear around these changes. In our college, 45% of our population, the student population, is Hispanic. Imagine that. So we're also a very diverse city, but instead of taking the approach that some government officials, not to mention any names, have taken recently. Instead of building walls, we want to build bridges. We want to build collaboration. And that is another one of the initiatives that we are implementing at PIMA with the leadership of Chancellor Lambert and myself. The Center for International Education and Global Engagement has been one of those responses to these transformations. And one of the programs that we have been implementing in the past 3 years is our Mexico project. Why our Mexico project? Well, we have a historical connection with Mexico. Arizona used to be part of Mexico, as probably most of you know. But there's a lot of marginalized Mexican origin populations in Tucson. So we want to honor their history. We want to connect with them because they're also part of our future. And why is this approach to, I'm putting all of this in context so that you see why our response is going in this direction. So again, in the national context, imagine, for example, the interaction that exists between corporations and nations in terms of foreign direct investment. This is investment that produces jobs, investment that is productive. I'm not talking speculative investment here. These are the factories that come from other countries. Look at the country with the most foreign direct investment. That's why walls do not work. Imagine, for example, if you want to produce a vehicle today, you have a product that is made of something like 30,000 different parts with lots of different processes, lots of different raw materials that come from many different countries. I went to the store the other day, and that's actually something I saw at the Home Depot. It says, made in the USA with global materials. So what does that tell us? The world is changing very fast, but guess what? Things do not change. People change. And that is a process. And if you think about it, it is an educational process. So when we talk about global education, we're thinking about that. In the US, there are many people who think that when they look at these brands, they think they're American. They're all foreign. And just to give you an example, Airbus in Alabama produces 48,000 direct and indirect jobs for Americans. Those brands you see there, they used to be American. Budweiser is Belgium, 7-Eleven is Japanese, Bridgestone, Firestone, Japanese, Adidas is German, so is Reebok, and even a landmark like the Chrysler Tower in New York. Do you know who owns the Chrysler Tower? It's a Middle Eastern investment company based in Abu Dhabi. So a quick exercise for you. I want you to think what the world is going to be like 50 years from now. And I'm showing you this illustration here. This is a photograph from the Rand Corporation. At the time in 1954, they asked the top scientists of the time to project what the future would be like. And one of the things they came up with was this prototype of a computer in the year 2004, 50 years later, we would be able to have computers at home. That's how they would look. Of course, in 2004, you could carry your computer under your arm, right? Now, imagine today, the pace of change is so much more rapid. It's incredibly fast, much, much faster than it was at that point in time. Where are we going to be 50 years from now? Hard to say, huh? Very hard to say. What we know, and we have heard in some of these presentations, is that humanity will change more in the next 20 years than in all of human history. It's hard to imagine when you read something like that. So we are responding to those realities. We were talking about flexibility and emotional intelligence, and many of these characteristics that are also applicable to organizations. So organizations need to become smart in that way as well. I'm almost done. So the one thing that we know, well, that we can expect to know, is that we are going to become more and more interconnected. If you look at history as a continuum and you think of the Chinese Empire and the Egyptians, the Roman Empire, all the great empires in history, you know that we have become more and more interconnected throughout history. This is what we can expect 50 years from now. We are probably going to become more and more interconnected, and we need to prepare ourselves for that. Like Chancellor Lambert likes to say, we need to look at trends. So I'm going to leave you with this reflection. Things change. But it is really people who change, not things. Thank you so much.